Welcome. Welcome to Wednesday night at NETIV. Excuse me. I hope you've had a chance to take a look at some of the shorts that have been put on our NETIV website. I find out that I've got several over there now that I didn't realize I had. And they seem to be being viewed, not only mine, but all of them that are there are being viewed quite often. So I'm really kind of excited about the fact more people can see us. So it's been a good thing. And so hopefully I can continue to give you something worth shorting anyway. So tonight I want to do chapter 7. And chapter 7 is far different than the first 6 chapters. We're not going to be doing a vision tonight. In fact, 7 and 8 really I wouldn't classify as visionary, but they're going to give us a capsulation of history and help us hopefully by filling in some of the blanks, it's going to hopefully give us some understanding of the times in which Zechariah was writing. So it's appropriate, I guess, more than anything else, that we're studying Zechariah at this point in time, and especially doing the time of the temple, because last Sunday, October 3rd, 2025, was a fast day. We were fasting Tish B'Av, the day used to remember the burning of both the first and the second temples. Now, in this chapter, we're going to be looking at events that brought down the first temple. And our story begins, if you look at the first verse, it says it happened in the 4th year of King Darius that the word of Hashem came to Zechariah on the 4th day of the 9th month in Kislev. Before we go farther, I don't know how many of you understand that Zechariah was not a young man. Zechariah himself had already gone through most, if not all, of the exile. He was now living in a time Cyrus the Persian had been there for a year and he was dethroned. Ahasuerus has come to throne. He's no longer there. And now we're looking at King Darius. Now, as we look at all of this, he is probably one of the senior elders of the Jewish faith at this particular point in time. Now, this particular portion seems to come about 2 years after the visions that he had regarding the temple itself. And so this story covers the idea of what was involved in Tish B'Av and the things that had to happen. Understand that the fasting that would go on, and especially for Tish B'Av, not so much for the other 3, but Tish B'Av, there are 21 sections or paragraphs dealing with things that were required in order for you to function and do correctly the fast of Tish B'Av. Now we're told that Isaiah, in Isaiah 45:1, that this Persian, Cyrus, this is the only time in the entire Tanakh in which we find that the Bible uses the term Mashiach to describe in this case, a Gentile, but anyone who was not in the priesthood. Now we know that the Mashiach, the name will be used again later when we talk about the coming Messiah. But right now, the only one that was ever given this title of Messiah was Cyrus the Persian. Now he gave the command or the ability for all the tribes to go home, not just Israel, but remember, prior to him, Babylon, Assyrians, all of those nations, whenever they captured a people, they oftentimes exiled them and brought others in to live in their place. Well, according to what's called the Cyrus Cylinder, we are told that Cyrus considered himself, the Babylonian god Marduk, and that his declaration was not only for the Jews, but it was for all nations that had been sent into exile by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And it was Cyrus's blessing that the Samaritans began to build their temple, their version of the Jewish temple, on Mount Gerizim. Remember, there were two mountains that were used by the Jews in order to identify those that were good blessings and those that were curses. Now, this would become a problem right away in the case of the Jews because they started out so late on the rebuilding of the temple. When they arrived in the land, they built the altar and they laid the foundation stones around to identify the perimeter of the temple itself. But at the same point in time, they went no farther than that because they all went home or went to where they considered their home so that they began to establish themselves. Now, the Assyrians sent in their places, they sent what we would call the Samaritans, who originally were called Kuthians. And they repopulated the territory of Samaria, which is the West Bank. And these people were idol worshippers. Now, God sent lions to decimate these people. And out of fear of the lions, the Kuthians, well, they converted to Judaism of sorts. But the rabbis of the Talmud debated whether their conversion was valid or not. Now, the Kuthians' Torah observance was based only on the words of the written Torah, putting them at odds with the Israelites who were obviously accepting the oral as well. Now, settling in the Syrian region of Eretz Israel, over time, the Kuthians became known as the Samaritans, but they weren't originally. Fearing that the Jews returning from Babylon would reclaim their ancestral land, the Kuthians became very bitter enemies of the Jewish people, and even going so far as to attempt to sabotage the construction of the Second Temple. Now, describing their evil intentions, the Kuthians offered to help build the temple itself, but realizing the Kuthians' real goal was to, well, obviously destroy that, they were rejected. Now, this all happened as a result of just years of separation. Remember, there were 70 years that Israel was not in the land. The Kuthians had been placed in the land, and they had obviously begun sooner. And not all of the Jews went home. According to many, the estimate was that there were only about 40,000 Jews that actually returned with the edict to go home and to rebuild their temple. Now, even then, only the temple altar and the perimeter, I guess, were built. And later, well, later they said, excuse me for water. It was later with the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah that the temple was completed. But it was smaller and far less glamorous than the first temple. In fact, for those who had seen the first temple, it was really disheartening. Now, albeit in despair, the temple, even after it was rebuilt over the next 400 some years, fell into disrepair. And because it was in disrepair, well, obviously it was not being used as it was intended. Now, Herod soon became the king or governor over the land of Israel. And in doing so, he had a situation where he did not like the priests. In fact, he purged the priests, killing all of them except one. The one was Babas ben Buddha. Now, Babas was actually a blind rabbi priest, and he was considered to be a disciple at one time of Shammai, and later he was identified as more moderate, more like Hillel. And he had a real deep sense of justice and balance. And in the process, he becomes the one go-to in the land. One of the most famous stories about Babas is the fact that he was found well, actually, he can be found in the Talmud in Baba Batra 3b and 4a. Herod, as you know, was paranoid. He was very power hungry, and He killed many members of not only the Sanhedrin, but just anyone who he feared. Now, there was one person that he did not kill, probably because he was blind, and that was Babas. In an attempt to suppress he found himself, well, Babas remained loyal, but at the same point in time, being blind, he found himself to be alone. Herod was finding it very, very difficult to rule over the people, so he disguised himself and he tested Babas regarding his loyalty because he had not really criticized Herod. Babas refused to curse or to even speak evil of the king, citing the Torah's command, do not curse a ruler of your people. Impressed by his integrity, Herod himself and asked how he could atone for his crimes. Well, Babas advised him to begin the process of returning the light to Israel. It's found in one of the verses where it says, you have extinguished the light of the world, the sages. Go and rebuild the light of the world, the temple. This statement, well, directly led to Herod's grand rebuilding of the Second Temple, which became one of the most magnificent structures in the ancient world. I was thinking about this today and yesterday. President Trump is remodeling the White House in a different image. A lot of history is now going up on the walls. He's turned the Rose Garden into a seated area. In fact, the grass is gone. And he's about to using help and volunteer money, rebuild or build himself what do you call it? It's not a meeting room, but it's much larger than that, a ballroom. Well, anyway, he continues on. Now, the princes were said to be very righteous in those days. In fact, Israel was righteous. It had put aside idolatry, which is rather interesting. And I'll get more into that as we go along. And the temple itself was actually up and functioning in some sense. Now, there were 4 holidays or 4 fast days that were involved in this fasting for the temple. Obviously, the 9th of Av was the most mentioned because it's the Tish B'Av, the day that both temples were destroyed. But there was also a fast on the 10th day of Teves when Nebuchadnezzar began his siege of Jerusalem. And then there was the fast of the 17th of Tammuz, which commemorates the breaching of the outer wall of Jerusalem. And then finally, on the 3rd day of Tishri, the Jews were to honor Gedaliah, who became the governor appointed by Nebuchadnezzar. And he was appointed for the governorship, but he was assassinated by Ishmael ben Nethathian, who happened to be a member of the royal house. In fact, he saw himself as being the ruler and not Gedaliah. Now, the prophets instituted these 4 feasts after the destruction of the temple. But at the same point in time, we're now going to find out something else is going on. They're building the temple. And so the question comes up, do we continue to fast if there is a temple? Well, while they're considering that, they're finding out at this very same time that there was the worshiping of Baal and Asherah, or the Queen of Heaven, who the Queen of Heaven happened to be multiple names of different religious orders, whether they were at all interested in all of those, and they were not. Jeremiah 7 deals with the great deal with the reasons for the temple or for the nation's fall. And in Jeremiah 7:30, he writes, they set up abominations in the house that is called by my name. Now, Israel's religious corruption made or led to the moral downfall. And in terms of social justice or social injustice, oppression of the women and the wives, the orphans, well, all of that became starkly clear. Corruption or corrupt leaders, from false prophets to priests and kings, had done their number. So in this house, which is called by my name, became a den of robbers, according to 7:11. Now, personally, the people violated the covenant they agreed to honor at Sinai. The people neglected the Torah and its commandments, and they failed to observe the sabbatical years, which was another reason in 2 Chronicles 36:21 that they were banished for 70 years to make up for the 70 years or the 490 years they had not honored the Shemitah. Now, in the Talmud, Yoma 9b, we're given a list of 3 primary sins that all nations seem to go through, but Israel was at the top of the list: idolatry, sexual immorality, and bloodshed. Now, these were rampant in the final generations of the kingdom of Judah prior to the first temple falling. But in mystical terms, the destruction occurred because, not so much because of everything that had gone on, but because God himself, the Shekinah, had departed from the temple due to all of the defilement that was going on. Ezekiel in chapters 10 and 11 spends a great deal of time talking about this period of time and what was going on. Now, in terms of the second temple, it survived 5 more years than the first. Now, with Ezra and Nehemiah, the Torah became truly important again. Early prayers to God kept the returning Jews from worshiping idols. And as they pleaded with God, they also asked for him to remove the temptation of sexual immorality. Well, God agreed to that, and so they were freed from sexual sins. But the problem was when they went out the next day to gather eggs from the chickens, they found out the chickens didn't lay any eggs. So the question is, sexual sins, though they're evil, are still a part of the process of reproduction. And so without them, there'd be a lot of things quite different. Now, these fasts were instituted along the lines similar to Yom Kippur, and they would last an entire day and contained, obviously, many provisions. Well, after the period of harsh decrees and the new era began, in which the temple was still in ruins, but the evil decrees no longer plagued them, the sages determined that the laws of the 3 other feasts, the 10th of Tav, or 10th of Tevet, and the 17th of Tammuz, and again for Gedalia, they wondered, do we need to honor them? Well, if they want to fast, they can do so. But if they do not want to, they do not have to do so. That was the understanding. Now, the question was, who created that understanding? Well, according to many of the writers, it was Zechariah. He was the one who made that call. Now, on Tisha B'Av, however, they were still obligated to fast, all under the circumstances because of the many other tragedies that are going to happen on that very same day. Remember, that day was also the day in which the spies returned with the evil report. On that day, later on, we're going to find out that the Bar Kokhba revolt was put down. We'll also find out that England will exile all the Jews that are there, and later they will be exiled from Spain. So the times are not going to be tranquil, but at the same point in time, the focus has got to be on the temple. As long as the temple sits in ruins, they must fast on that day, and as the prophets enacted it according to Rosh Hashanah 18b. This is the fundamental difference between Tisha B'Av and these other minor fasts. Their obligation to fast on Tisha B'Av is based on the ruling of the Great Assembly. Now, therefore, all the laws of the fast apply in their entirety, which includes 21 rules that were given. Now, on the minor fasts, however, the obligation was based on custom. And because all of Israel agreed to fast on those days until the temple was rebuilt, that is what continued. But as soon as the temple was completed, the second temple, the fast disappeared. So, as we're going through this, understand Israel before the destruction of Jerusalem was considered an independent nation. But after the Babylonian exile, they're going to be returning, but their kingdom is really not theirs. It's really Persia's, and it's going to be later, it's going to be Greece, and eventually it's going to become Rome's. Now, it had a 72-year period since the temple was destroyed on Tish B'Av, the 9th of Av. Radak believed that those Jews still in Babylon were not convinced the efforts to rebuild would ever work out. And after all, the enemies of Israel were numerous and formidable, which appears to be why many chose not to return. Other scholars like Abarbanel believe that they did not receive, uh, the significance, or they did not understand the significance of the temple. It is hard for us even today to understand how significant the third temple will be in our lifetime. It will bring amazing things. It is going to open up the windows of heaven, and a great amount of Shefa flow will come from the heaven through the temple into where we're at, which we see when they begin to look at Ezekiel, those chapter 46, when the stream of water flows from the temple from inside the Holy of Holies all the way out and becomes a stream, then it becomes a river, in which there are great trees that are planted along the river for healing. So the temple itself is very significant. Now they understand that the divine presence would not reside there because they were not able to find the Ark of the Covenant. Now they believed that the Persians would push them out after a while anyway, so they were not too worried about it. But the fact that there is no significant ingathering of Jews from the other 10 tribes did not bring, well, it just didn't bring peace. After all, there's only 40,000 on the first return. There were many other returns, but it was not what was expected. But again, as we look at the nation of Israel today, how many Jews have not returned? Now, the surrounding nations themselves were a constant threat, which I've already mentioned, and it led them to believe that the final redemption, well, it just hasn't arrived, and it won't arrive. Many noticed that the land was yielding the crops as it had before the exile, but the final concern was the fact that it was not as great as it should be. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 11, verse number 4, it reads, "And he will judge the destitute with righteousness and decide the fairness for the humble of the earth. And he will strike the wicked of the world with the rod of his mouth, and with his breath out of his lips he shall slay the wicked." But it goes on to say that the time of the Messiah, the greatest understanding will be the coming of fruit and vegetables. I don't know if you realize, but if you go into Costco's to buy fruit, you would find Israeli fruit in Costco. You also have vegetables, and they were the leading producers of vegetables for the Europeans. And they flowers, all of those things came from Israel now, which tells me we're not that far away from the Messiah. Now, Rabbi Greenbaum noted regarding this question, just as such doubts are very discouraging to those who have settled in the national home in order to rebuild and restore its glory, so the niggling halachic question about whether it was still necessary to fast for Tish B'Av was also very discouraging to the brave pioneer returnees from Babylon to Jerusalem, who were working so hard to rebuild the temple, even against the forces of the Samaritans. Now, apparently, the Kohanim were unable to answer the question of should we or shouldn't we, and the message was forwarded to Zechariah, which I mentioned before. He is the one that actually made the decision on how this was going to work out. But remember, Zechariah is one of the last of the prophets. There's nearly after Zechariah and Malachi, and those are prophets from the first temple period. The second temple period, there are really no prophets. The holiness of prophecy will disappear. That does not mean that there won't be some inspiration prophetically, but it does not mean that there will be anything that'll be tangibly, easily understood. So Zechariah's response will not appear until much later in the book of, well, actually, for me, it's in the book of chapter 8, verses 18 and 19. That's when he begins to remark on this whole issue of Tish B'Av. So as we continue on, we need to learn that God's thoughts on this question as he asks through the prophet, was the fasting that you fasted in my honor, or was it for me, or was it for me? God understands that oftentimes people use lip service when they really aren't certain what's going on. Now, the fast was intended to make the people aware of the sins that caused the destruction of the temple. And in some sense, it had. They were no longer idolaters. But in another sense, the second temple is going to be destroyed simply because of their egos, if I would use that term, because they will find themselves at odds with each other. Now, in Zechariah 7, 9, and 10, we read this injunction. God, or judge with truthful justice and perform kindness and mercy towards one another. Do not oppress the widow and the orphan and the stranger and the poor, and do not think in your heart of wronging one another. That was the problem that would be coming. God was admonishing them to extend themselves beyond the letter of the law. They need to be benevolent and merciful to one another. They were to carefully avoid oppressing the less fortunate, the widows, the orphans. Now, monetarily, as well as with watching their language, their cruelty that comes from the tongue. And it would have been then that God would execute justice against Israel's enemies. Now, it was at this point that Zechariah explained what went wrong and caused the destruction of the first temple and the exile of his people. And we learned that for the new temple to succeed and endure, the people had to take to heart that it was precisely because of the early generations' refusal to listen to the voice of the prophets and to follow the Torah sincerely that the destruction and the exile came about. Now, he would note that they made their hearts like a shamir. Now, shamir in Ezekiel chapter 3, verse 9 talks about shamir being a strong metal. Some say it's a kind of a flint or an iron. But it's also, the shamir was also a worm that was used in the days of Solomon to cut the rocks that were used in the building of that first temple. So I'm not sure exactly what that idea is. Well, anyway, Moses was said to have used this worm to engrave the names of the tribes on the stones used on the breastplate of the high priest. And it seems the messages of the prophets could not, well, they just couldn't penetrate their hearts. And as a result, God raged against his people for a second time in about 400 years, and it will fall again. But now, as the second temple was nearing completion, God was again warning them to become receptive to God's words and thereby avoid God turning a deaf ear to their cries once again. Now, the result of this turning away would mean that his people would become truly storm-tossed and scattered among the nations of the world. In fact, there isn't a nation in this world that probably doesn't have at least one Jew. They would find themselves among the people that they never even knew. And this was a true reason for fasting and prayer. People themselves were responsible for turning the pleasant land into a place of desolation. Now, next time we're going to continue this story and move a little bit faster at a better pace as we go through. But I just wanted to give you at this understanding. Zechariah is aged. He is not a young man. At the same time, he is dealing with not only prophetically with the people, with those 6 prophecies that he gave in the first chapters, but he's also dealing with the idea of the completion of the temple. We know that Ezra and Nehemiah were crucial in that process, but so was Zechariah, and so was Malachi. In fact, Ezra, Malachi, and Zechariah are the last of the prophets. After this, the word of God is their only answer, unless they have intuition. So I like to end now and give you people a chance to think about what we've talked about and maybe even give an answer to what's going on. So I shall quit and I shall take a drink of water while you think.